Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for the Security Day IL conference. It's a pleasure to be here once again this year in this amazing event. I'm so happy to talk to you today about some of the cloud security mistakes that I'm seeing people doing in the cloud today so that I can help you prevent this from happening to you. Let's get started. First of all, pleasure to meet you. My name is Shira Shamban. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Solvo. I'm a security expert with specific interest in cloud security. I've been working in domain security in the past, and today I work here at Solvo. Other than that, I'm also the co-chair of OWASP Israel. I'm also a contributor for the Cloud Security Alliance. I'm an AWS community builder, and I run the Security Diva mentoring program here in Tel Aviv. I'll be happy to see you in one of the coming events that we have. I have a lot of passion for cloud security, and this is exactly why I decided to have this session today with you. So again, thank you for joining me, and let's get started. What are we going to do today? I am going to share with you 4 popular security challenges I see today and 4 easy strategies to help you mitigate and prevent these kind of mistakes. And I will finish up with an actionable summary. So things you can do by yourself starting today. Let's start with the first mistake that we're seeing in the cloud. This is accidental cloud data access and data leakage. First of all, where are your sensitive resources stored? Usually when I ask this question, I'm getting different answers like, I know where all my sensitive resources are, they're well protected. But unfortunately, very often I see people surprised at the places where they found sensitive resources. And the reason for that is because in the cloud, we have very dynamic environments and many different people touching those environments. So you might assume that the sensitive data is stored very well protected in the production environment, but one of your developers decided to take a dump of this data, just a little piece of it, and test the new algorithm they wrote in a dev environment. So now you have a duplicate of this data that is unprotected and you're unaware of. So when I ask, where are your sensitive resources? This is what I mean. It's not only the data resources you know and familiar with, it's the shadow data or surprisingly data resources that you can find. Who or what has access to your resources? Some people might find this question a little weird. What do you mean, what has access? In the cloud, you have human identities and you have identities that belong to machines, and both can have access to your data resources. So it's very important to understand who among your users and who among your data resources have access to your data. I will also elaborate later about third parties that also might have access to your sensitive resources. Now, one interesting thing is public internet access. I thought that we're already past this problem, but unfortunately, so many people today find themselves surprised with resources that are connected either directly or indirectly to the internet. When I say indirectly, I mean, let's say an S3 bucket that it does not have a direct internet access, but is connected to an EC2 instance that does have internet access. So this means that in 2 hops, we might be able to get into this data resource, and it does have some kind of internet access. So we need to be aware of it and make sure it is a necessary access. Now, how are we going to handle these challenges? So here are a few simple things you can do yourselves today. First of all, control all of your data resources in all of your environments. This is not as difficult as you might imagine. It means that you need to list all the existing data resources and make sure you're aware of every new data resource that is spinned up in your account. This is something you can do using simple rules that are very, very easy to implement, making sure that you're familiar with every new cloud resource that is spinned up, every new data resource that is spinned up, and also make sure it is spinned up with relevant security protocols or measurements. For example, making sure it is encrypted by design, and making sure it does not have excessive access, or making sure it has a data retention policy. It's also very important to understand the kind of permissions or access your existing data resources have. So reviewing the current permissions versus the needed permissions. Most of the time we see that every data resource has a lot of existing permissions, but they don't need that many. So making sure that only the necessary permissions are given is extremely important. This is not something you do once a year. This is something you have to do continuously. The best way to do it, obviously, I don't expect you to audit your account and your resources every week. So the best way to do it would probably be creating some kind of monitoring on your environment to make sure that whenever there is a violation of the things that I described before, you will get notified over Slack, over Teams, in any way you like to consume your alerts. Let's move on to the next challenge. Third-party access and supply chain challenges. So this is something I started talking about in the previous challenge that we discussed. Who can connect to an external product? And when I say an external product, I mean several different things that all of us are using one way or another. All of us are using some kind of monitoring tool. Could be Sumo Logic, could be Datadog. Most of us are using a security tool. It could be Solvo, and it could be Prisma, and it could be Qualys, but we're using some kind of security tools in our account. And sometimes we're using other products that are used in our product. For example, if your product is using Twilio to send text messages to your customers, then this is also a third party that has some kind of access to your cloud environment. So who is allowed to connect third parties into our account? This is something that we can define in the user policy, and we need to make sure that only necessary users get this kind of permission. Do we have any third parties in our account today? Usually the answer would be yes, but which ones, and how can we make sure that the ones that we're using, we actually need to use? We don't have access to third parties that we're not using, and making sure that we are aware of every new third-party access that is granted in our account. So what are we going to do to handle this? First of all is review users with high permissions. And when I say high permissions, I don't only mean admin permissions. I also mean permissions to niche actions like connecting cross-account roles that enable us this kind of access to third parties. Now, one thing you would want to do is list all the third parties and cross-account roles that you have in your account. First and foremost, to understand what exactly do you have in your account. Sometimes you will be surprised to see that you have access to products you're not using anymore. And when you have permission that you're not familiar with and that you're not using anymore, this widens your attack surface. This means that if that third party gets hacked, depending on the kind of permission that you gave them, this might put you in a risk as well. So you need to be aware of it and remove the permissions that are not in use. And this is the last point I wanted to discuss. Make sure that you only give the permissions that you need. And if you're not using a product anymore, remove their permissions, revoke them. You might also want to make sure that if this is a service or a third party that you're actually using, that you're familiar and understand the kind of privileges that you granted them. Sometimes by default, they ask for high privileges, and it makes sense to reduce that to just the permissions that you're feeling comfortable with and that make sense based on the service that you're consuming from them. Moving on to the next challenge, misconfiguration. As you probably know, misconfiguration is a very wide term, but at the end of the day, because we are human beings, we all make mistakes and we all misconfigure to a certain extent. Every cloud account, it never happens that I see an account that has zero misconfigurations and no security violations or mistakes. One of the biggest challenges in the cloud happens because so many different people and personas are touching the cloud infrastructure. Some of them are security professionals. Some of them are people who understand about infrastructure, like DevOps engineers. And some of them are people like developers, software developers, who are not security professionals. And we're not going to turn them into security professionals anytime soon. So as a part of their daily work, sometimes they make mistakes. And we are here to help them reduce. It will never be a total elimination, but at least reduce the mistakes they're making, especially not letting them do the low-hanging mistakes. This is really a waste of time. So how often do you make changes in your cloud environment? Who is allowed to make changes in the cloud environment, and in which environment exactly? I don't assume you let everyone touch the production environment, but just in case you do, now is the time to make sure only necessary engineers have access to production, and that each developer has access only to their environment, non-production environment, maybe environments that are gated in a certain way, again, to prevent potential damage that will come with a misconfiguration. Who can make changes to security settings? Just the fact that someone is a developer in our organization doesn't mean they necessarily need to be able to make changes to security settings. Sometimes we need to bring them some out-of-the-box environments or templates to play with, again, to prevent as much as we can potential misconfigurations. The last thing I would like to talk about is the blast radius. A part of the misconfiguration, or even before the misconfiguration, a part of the configuration means we need to build an environment from network configuration, from identity and access management configuration, and configuration of different cloud services and APIs. And this all together builds our attack surface, the potential place where things could get wrong. And when I talk about blast radius, I mean looking at a specific resource and understanding what can be impacted by a misconfiguration of this resource. This means that we always have to make sure we understand both IAM and network access. So this is the blast radius, understanding the rest of the resources that are connected to this cloud resource that we're looking at. If this resource is misconfigured, what else might be impacted? How can we handle this? We need to understand our users and our procedures. How are things being done in our environment? Who is allowed to do it? What exactly are they allowed to do? And making sure not to be shy, to give just the right permission to every user. Control our blast radius. First of all, we need to understand the blast radius. We need to understand how can we get access from one place to another. And this means we need kind of a map or a graph to tell us how could we potentially have access from one place to another, and then see if we have any specific crown jewels or extra sensitive areas in our application that if they get hacked, if they get leaked, if they are being put out of use, would this affect our business? Once we understand that, we will start controlling the blast radius and making sure that we put the right guardrails in place so that we can limit the blast radius. Last thing is to get notified immediately for crucial violations. I'm sure that all of you, when you log into your favorite security products, you have dozens or hundreds of different security findings, and it is what it is. But let's make sure that if a really critical violation happens that puts your sensitive resources at risk, you will get a push notification about it. And this is usually something you can connect and integrate to your favorite instant messaging or email server, just to make sure that we don't waste time around that. Next and last issue for today is misuse of identity and access management. Identity and access management is the most popular and I would say most important security mechanism that we have today for cloud applications. This is what helps us to make sure we configured the components right and only enable the necessary access, the necessary actions for or between the entities that need that. It means we need to make sure that both the users and the resources have an identity, and that this identity contains only what they actually need in order to perform their jobs. For the users, that means that a DevOps engineer might have a different permission than a developer. And for the cloud components, it means that an internet-facing EC2 instance would have different permissions than an instance that is a part of our backend. It does not need any direct internet access. Now, many organizations are using AWS managed policies or create an organizational internal repo for allowed or reviewed security permissions. The problem with these two approaches is the fact that we need to create a bunch or take out of the box pre-configured permissions, and they are never adjusted or adapted to your application. They're very generic. So they don't include, for example, the name of the specific bucket we need access to, or they will contain a long list of actions because this needs to fit different use cases. So using pre-configured policies will always be too broad than what we need. So there is this tension between moving fast with wide permissions and moving possibly a little slower, but making sure that we don't have a lot of excessive permissions that can be exploited. Last problem is whose job is to do IAM security. In every organization, I hear a different answer. Sometimes it's like, we hope that people just do it without having a specific person. Sometimes it's a responsibility in the DevOps team, which they might or might not be fully proficient with. And sometimes it's the responsibility of the security team. Very often it's a little too late when the security team is the first one to do IAM security, because usually that happens at the end of the software development lifecycle when it's a little harder to fix mistakes. So how are we going to handle this? First of all, we need to remember that every entity must have an IAM policy, and we need to try and make sure it is least privileged. Least privileged means we only grant it the necessary permissions it needs in order to do its job. We need to do it for users, we could do it for groups, and we can do it for the container and for the S3 and for the Lambda function. So every component should use this. We should try and make it dynamic. So the security policies should be dynamic based of the needs of the applications. Now, you might review your application today and force security policies, but in 1 hour, your team is going to deploy a new component, a new piece of code that requires additional permissions. So this means that we also need some kind of a dynamic mechanism that will help us to adjust the security permissions accordingly. Last thing is everyone should be aware of the risks of misuse of IAM, because everyone touches IAM. If our developers will understand it, they will help us to enforce better security practices. So let's wrap this up. What did we learn today? First of all, I suggest you list all your data resources and monitor their journey. Monitor if they migrated from production to a dev environment, understand where do you have duplicates of your data, and make sure you have the right security guardrails in place. When doing architecture, think about the blast radius. Think about the network access, think about the users, think about the third-party access. All of these have an effect on your crown jewels and or on the sensitive resources. Put relevant guardrails and get notified for violations. Don't wait for next year's audit. You can get notified today when a violation occurs and make sure it doesn't happen again. Use native capabilities for security. So the cloud vendors have native services, and I strongly encourage you to start by turning these ones on and making sure that they answer your pain points in the cloud. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Good luck on your cloud security journey. You can do this. I believe in you.